The train screamed across the Texas plains like a wounded beast, its steel ribs glowing under the merciless sun. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and disbelief. German women, some in tattered auxiliary uniforms, others in plain gray dresses, sat pressed against the wooden benches, their faces drawn and hollow. They had been soldiers, nurses, translators, and camp workers in the wreckage of a dying Reich. Now, they were prisoners of war, crossing oceans not toward punishment, but toward something far stranger, mercy. When the doors finally groaned open, the women blinked into a light so bright it felt almost cruel. A gust of dry wind tore through their hair and coats, carrying the scent of hay, horses, and roasted corn. The ground shimmered with heat. For the first time in months, there were no sirens, no rubble, no sound of planes. Only a wide horizon, so open it frightened them. A guard shouted something in English, but the tone was gentle, almost embarrassed. The American soldiers were young, sunburned men in loose uniforms and wide-brimmed hats, their rifles slung casually as though war had already left their bones. A few leaned against trucks, chewing gum, tipping their hats. To these men, war was ending on the wind. To the women stepping down from the train, it was still clinging to their skin. One woman, no older than 20, stumbled and fell. Her name was Marta, a former field nurse from Hamburg. An American soldier, barely older than she was, offered his hand. "Easy now, ma'am," he said in a drawl that turned the word into music. She hesitated. Her commanders had warned her of these men, the enemy, the brutes of propaganda. Yet his hand was steady, palm open, sunlight gleaming off the sweat on his wrist. She took it. They were loaded into trucks that rattled through the countryside, passing golden fields and wooden barns that looked untouched by war. Children waved at them from fences, mothers held babies, dogs barked and ran beside the wheels. The German women stared in silence. This land, this America, felt like a hallucination drawn by someone who had never known hunger. The camp sat outside a small town called Ralston, a patch of dust and dreams carved into the plains. It was fenced, yes, but the barbed wire glistened lazily in the sun, more symbolic than threatening. The barracks smelled of pine wood and soap. Instead of guards barking orders, the women were met by a man in a cowboy hat and a smile so wide it seemed impossible. "Ladies," he said, "welcome to Texas." The word welcome hung in the air like a foreign bird. They didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Inside the camp, there was order, but also something unexpected: kindness. The women were given clean sheets, fresh water, and medical checkups. Some received shoes. Others were handed bars of soap wrapped in paper with cursive writing, Palmolive. It smelled like spring. Marta held hers to her nose and whispered, "This is what peace must smell like." The Americans called them the Fräuleins, a term that was part joke, part fascination. Cowboys wandered by the fences to watch them hang laundry, sometimes trading jokes through broken English. A few even tipped their hats, earning awkward smiles or nervous giggles in return. To the townspeople, the arrival of German women prisoners was the talk of every porch and diner. Some were suspicious. "Ain't right, giving comfort to the enemy," said one farmer, but most were curious. They'd seen the photos of bombed-out Europe, the starving faces in newspapers. Now those faces were here, folding sheets, mending uniforms, blinking in the southern sun. In the evenings, the sky turned molten gold, and the camp grew quiet. The women would sit outside their barracks, brushing their hair or mending clothes, watching the Americans play baseball beyond the wire. The sound of laughter carried through the air like a melody from another world. For the first time since the war began, Marta felt something dangerous: safety. But safety brought guilt. When the sun sank and the crickets began their chorus, memories returned like ghosts. The flash of bombs over Hamburg. The smell of burning bread. Her brother's last letter, never answered. She would lie awake on her bunk, the sounds of cowboy laughter mingling with the crackle of her conscience. Days turned to weeks. Work was assigned: kitchen duty, laundry, sewing. Marta was placed in the infirmary, assisting an American nurse who treated her with brisk professionalism. "You're good with your hands," the nurse said one day, smiling. "Guess war teaches us all something." Marta didn't know how to reply. She simply nodded, hands trembling over a bandage. Sometimes, at the edge of camp, She'd see American men practicing their roping skills, lassoing wooden posts and laughing when they missed. One afternoon, a soldier called out to her, grinning, "Bet you've never seen a cowboy before, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Only in dreams," she said in broken English. The soldier laughed and tipped his hat. "Then welcome to the dream, ma'am." That night, as the camp lights flickered on, the women gathered near the mess hall. The air carried a new scent, rich, savory, impossible. It was meat. Real meat. The smell of sizzling fat and butter drifted through the wire, mingling with the warmth of the lanterns. They whispered among themselves, unable to believe it. Could it be steak in captivity for them? Marta pressed her palm to her mouth, eyes wide. For months they had eaten nothing but thin soup and crusts of bread. Now, in a land that had never known true hunger, they were to be fed like guests. One American guard chuckled as he watched their disbelief. "You gals act like you've seen a miracle," he said. Marta turned to him, her eyes wet but bright. "Maybe we have," she whispered. And when the dinner bell rang, a clear, ringing sound that cut through the twilight, it wasn't just a call to eat. It was the sound of something deeper, the first note of mercy echoing across the ruins of war. The women rose slowly, stepping toward the mess hall like pilgrims to an altar. The camp lights glowed soft and gold against the endless dark. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote howled, lonely and wild. Marta paused, her hand resting on the doorframe, the scent of steak wrapping around her like memory and miracle intertwined. She took a breath, steady but trembling. Behind her, the others waited in silence. Ahead, the unknown waited on a plate. And as the first tear slipped down her cheek, the war, for one fragile heartbeat, seemed to stop breathing. The mess hall glowed with lantern light, its wooden beams shimmering with the heat of summer and the sizzle of oil. Outside, the Texas night hummed with crickets, but inside was silence. Dozens of German women stood uncertainly in a line, their hands clasped, their eyes darting from the steaming trays to the smiling cooks. The scent of seared beef and buttered potatoes floated through the air like a promise too good to trust. For weeks, they had lived on thin soup and dry bread. Even before their capture, rations in Germany had dwindled to shadows of meals, black bread, turnip stew, sometimes coffee made of roasted acorns. So when they were told to take a tray and move down the line, they hesitated as though stepping into a dream that might vanish if they breathed too loudly. Marta was among the first. Her stomach twisted painfully, half hunger, half disbelief. The American behind the counter, broad-shouldered, freckled, and humming a country tune, placed a slab of steak on her plate, its juices pooling like a small miracle. Beside it came a scoop of mashed potatoes, so creamy they looked like clouds. "Gravy, ma'am?" he asked, his accent thick with warmth. She blinked, not understanding. The nurse beside her whispered the translation, and Marta nodded quickly. The man smiled, drizzling thick brown gravy until it nearly overflowed. When she turned to find a seat, the room seemed unreal. White plates, silver forks, laughter at the far end where American guards were teasing each other over burned onions. The women sat stiffly, their eyes darting to the windows, to the exits, to the soldiers watching with bored kindness. No one knew if it was a trick, a test, or some strange American ritual of pity. The first bite broke her. Marta cut a small piece of meat, lifted it to her lips, and chewed slowly. It was warm, tender, alive with salt and butter. Tears welled before she could stop them. Across from her, another woman, Ingrid, a former secretary from Bremen, was already sobbing openly, her hand trembling over her fork. "It tastes like before," she whispered. Marta nodded, unable to speak. Around them, the sound of quiet crying filled the hall, dozens of women remembering what kindness used to taste like. The American cooks exchanged glances, unsure what to do. One finally said softly, "Guess they like it." Laughter rippled down the serving line, light and awkward, a thin thread of humanity trying to bridge an ocean of loss. Outside, the prairie wind carried the smell of beef fat and wild sage. It drifted through the open windows, mingling with the faint strains of a harmonica someone played near the gate. The tune was lazy, melancholy, something about home, about waiting. A few women turned their heads toward it, letting the music mix with the taste of meat, the salt of tears. When the meal was over, coffee was served, real coffee, rich and dark. Some women refused at first, thinking it must be a joke. One brave soul tasted it, gasped, and began to laugh. Soon, laughter bubbled across the tables, nervous and pure, like water finally breaking through ice. For the first time in years, they felt the absurd luxury of fullness. But fullness brought confusion. Marta watched the American guards chatting by the doorway, their faces soft with amusement. They had killed Germans, maybe even people she'd known. And now they were feeding her as if none of it had happened. The contradiction made her dizzy. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat thrum like a trapped bird. Later, as the women cleared their plates, one of the soldiers lingered near the table. He was young, perhaps 20, with a grin that couldn't stay hidden for long. "Steak okay, ma'am?" he asked in slow English. Marta hesitated, then found her words. "Too good," she said, and flushed with embarrassment. The young man laughed. "That's what Texas does best." Then, more gently, "Ain't right for anyone to go hungry, not even the enemy." She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. But that line, "not even the enemy," echoed in her mind long after he left. It was as though the walls of the camp had widened, the word enemy melting into something shapeless, tender, and unbearable. In the barracks that night, the women lay awake, whispering. Some spoke of home, some of shame. Ingrid murmured, "I feel guilty for liking it." Another answered, "So do I." Marta stared at the ceiling, the ghost of steak still on her tongue, and thought of her mother scraping burned potatoes from the bottom of a pan during the last winter in Hamburg. She had sworn never to forget that taste. Now, this new one would haunt her just as deeply. In the darkness, a guard walked past the window, his boots crunching on gravel. The sound was slow, almost reverent. Marta imagined what he might be thinking. Perhaps he saw them not as prisoners but as women like his own sisters, caught in the wrong uniform. Perhaps he, too, was trying to make peace through something as simple as supper. Before sleep took her, Marta reached beneath her bunk and touched the bar of soap she'd kept hidden since arrival. It still smelled of spring. She pressed it to her lips, not to wash but to remember. The scent of mercy, the warmth of food, the strange weight of being cared for by those she was taught to fear. Days followed with more meals, more small mercies. Each supper chipped away at something invisible inside them, leaving both relief and ache. Some women began smiling when addressed, others dared to hum songs while they worked. The Americans noticed. "Guess the Fräuleins are settlin' in," a guard said, tossing a ball of bread into the air. But there was one who never quite laughed. Marta carried her calm like armor, polite but distant. Each time she ate, she looked at the steak as though it were both salvation and sin. She could not forget what it meant, that while her people starved across the ocean, she was being fattened by the enemy's kindness. One evening, the cook found her lingering at the counter after everyone else had gone. He wiped his hands on a towel and said, "You know, ma'am, my mama used to say, feeding someone is the fastest way to make peace." Marta met his eyes. "Peace," she repeated softly, almost tasting the word. "It is heavy." The man smiled, puzzled, and went back to scrubbing the pans. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, a low growl promising rain. Marta stepped to the doorway, breathing in the scent of the coming storm. The night wind carried both the sweetness of butter and the sting of distance. Somewhere in that mixture lay the truth she could not yet name, that kindness could wound as deeply as cruelty, and sometimes it was harder to forgive mercy than hate. And when lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the camp's silver wire, she saw her reflection in it, half prisoner, half guest, and realized the war inside her had only just begun. The morning began with the clang of the camp bell and the smell of cornbread drifting through the air. Sunlight spilled over the fences, painting the barbed wire silver. The German women rose from their bunks, tying their hair, buttoning their plain cotton dresses, no longer soldiers, not quite civilians. Beyond the fence, a cowboy's laughter mingled with the bray of a mule, and somewhere, a radio played faint swing music. It might have been a dream, if not for the wire that glinted like a reminder that mercy had boundaries. Marta stood by the laundry tubs, her hands red from the lye soap, steam rising around her like fog. Across from her, Ingrid was humming a German lullaby as she scrubbed sheets. The rhythm of their work matched the pulse of the camp. Water splashing, guards calling, footsteps on gravel. Life, pared down to motion and waiting. After breakfast, a truck arrived from town with sacks of grain and laughter. The driver, a ruddy-faced farmer named Clay, waved at the women as though they were neighbors instead of captives. "Mornin', ladies," he called. "Hope you're treatin' our water better than we treat yours." The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the smile. Marta raised a cautious hand. For a moment, it felt like the fence between them was made of air. The camp, despite its purpose, breathed gentleness. There were rules, curfews, counts, daily chores, but no cruelty. The guards were mostly young men who preferred baseball to violence. They taught the women American phrases, trading words like candy, howdy, thank you, home. The women, in return, taught them bits of German, bit, Himmel, Frieden, heaven, peace, words that seemed to dissolve into the wind as soon as they were spoken. Marta found herself assigned to the infirmary, a quiet building on the camp's edge. She worked alongside a nurse named Helen Carter, a woman with kind eyes and hands that moved with practiced grace. At first, they worked in silence, the air between them heavy with difference. But one afternoon, as Marta carefully folded bandages, Helen said softly, "You're quick. You ever done this before?" Marta nodded, replying in halting English. "War hospital. Too much blood." Helen's expression softened. "Too much everywhere," she murmured. For a moment, their eyes met, two women on opposite sides of a world torn in half, recognizing something shared. From then on, Helen would sometimes bring Marta a biscuit from the mess hall or show her how to pronounce words more clearly. Marta would respond with tiny gifts, a daisy tucked into a napkin, a small embroidered handkerchief. The camp began to feel like a strange imitation of life. There were church services on Sundays, music nights when the guards played harmonica and banjo, even a small garden the prisoners were allowed to tend. The earth was stubborn, but under their care it yielded beans and tomatoes, bursts of color against the dust. The Americans called it the Peace Patch. Still, guilt crept in like a shadow at dusk. Letters from Germany came in frequently, their words smudged with sorrow. Marta read one from her mother, describing bombed streets and ration lines that stretched for hours. Her brother, once a soldier, was missing. Marta folded the paper with shaking hands, the words echoing, "You are lucky, my daughter. Lucky to be alive." The word lucky felt heavy, undeserved. She hid the letter under her mattress, unable to throw it away. In the evenings, when the sky turned violet and the cicadas began their slow song, the women gathered near the fence. The Americans would sit just outside, passing a guitar between them. Songs floated back and forth, Lily Marlene, "You Are My Sunshine." Two melodies, two tongues, finding harmony through the wire. Even the guards grew quiet when the voices met. It was as if the music erased the barbs for a moment, leaving only sound and breath and the ache of homes too far to see. One night, Helen brought a small mirror to the infirmary and placed it in Marta's hands. "You never look at yourself," she said gently. Marta stared into it, startled by the woman staring back. Cheeks fuller, eyes softer, a touch of sun in her hair. "I look not prisoner," she said slowly. Helen smiled. "That's the point." But the reflection unsettled Marta. To look alive while her country lay in ruins felt like betrayal. The next morning, a new arrival broke the fragile peace. A soldier from Europe, still in mud-stained boots, stepped off a jeep with a satchel of documents. He spoke in low tones to the camp commander, and though no one could hear, something shifted in the air. Later that day, Helen found Marta by the laundry tubs. "There's talk," she said quietly. "The war's ending. Maybe soon." Marta froze, the wet fabric clinging to her wrists. The word ending should have felt like sunlight. Instead, it felt like a blade. Freedom meant going back, to rubble, to loss, to ghosts. She turned toward the fence, where the prairie stretched endless and golden. America had been her enemy, yet here she had found her first breath of peace. What waited across the ocean was not peace, it was memory and hunger and questions without answers. That evening, a storm gathered on the horizon, the kind that rolled in without mercy. Lightning flickered behind the hills, and the wind carried the smell of rain and dust. The guards rushed to secure equipment, and the women hurried to bring in laundry. As thunder cracked, one of the lines snapped loose, sheets whipping like ghosts in the dark. Marta and Helen ran after them, laughing breathlessly, hair plastered to their faces. For a moment, they were just two women in the rain, their laughter louder than the storm. When they finally took shelter under the awning, drenched and shivering, Helen looked at Marta and said, "You know, when this is all over, maybe you'll stay a nurse. World could use more of those." Marta smiled faintly. World could use less reason for them. The storm passed quickly, leaving puddles that reflected the fence lights like stars caught in water. The next morning, the air was washed clean, and the camp felt fragile in its calm, as if everyone sensed that the wind had shifted. By noon, the American commander gathered the prisoners and guards in the yard. His voice carried over the dry grass, "The war in Europe is over." The words fell heavy and slow, sinking into the soil. Cheers erupted from the Americans. Some of the women cried out, others stood still, their faces unreadable. Marta felt the world tilt beneath her feet. That night, she sat by the fence, touching the damp earth. Freedom had come, but it was the kind that asked a price. Behind her, laughter echoed faintly, and in the distance, a coyote called to the open plains. Marta closed her eyes. The air smelled of rain and steel. And though the war had ended, something deeper within her had only just begun to stir, something that whispered she might never feel at home again, no matter which side of the wire she stood on. The gates opened with a sound like breath being released after years underwater. Beyond them, the world stretched vast and unknown, the Texas sun spilling over the fields as if blessing their departure. A truck waited to carry the German women to the train that would take them to the coast, and then home, if home still existed. The Americans stood nearby, hats in hand, their faces a mix of relief and quiet sorrow. For months they had guarded these women, fed them, joked with them, learned their names. Now, the war said it was time to forget. Marta stood among the departing crowd, her suitcase small and neatly tied with rope. Her dress was faded but clean, her hair pinned with care. She looked older than when she'd arrived, though not in the way war had aged her before. This was a different kind of weariness, the kind that comes from being shown mercy and not knowing what to do with it. Helen stood beside the truck, arms folded, pretending to scold. "Don't go starting another war just to come back here for my biscuits," she said with a smile that almost held. Marta laughed softly. "No promises." Their eyes met for a moment too long, both women knowing they were saying more than goodbye. The commander read the list of names, his voice steady. When he finished, he stepped back and nodded to the guards. "Open it." The last creak of the gate felt final, like the closing of a hymn. The women stepped through slowly, some crossing themselves, others holding back tears. Marta hesitated, her hand brushing the fence post, warm from the sun, smooth where countless fingers had touched it over the months. It no longer felt like a barrier, only a memory made of metal and forgiveness. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, the women looked back one last time. The camp grew smaller, its fences glinting like threads of silver in the light. A group of soldiers waved. One lifted his hat and shouted, "Auf Wiedersehen." His accent mangled the word, and laughter broke through the tears. For a moment, the war felt far away. The journey home was slow. Across the ocean, Germany waited, a skeleton of a country trying to remember its shape. When the ship reached Bremerhaven, the women stood on deck, the smell of smoke and salt filling their lungs. Cities were gone. Streets had no names. Families had scattered like dust. Marta walked through the ruins of Hamburg and found her mother's house a pile of bricks. Only the iron stove remained, half buried. She knelt and touched it, whispering a prayer without words. In the months that followed, she worked in a relief kitchen, serving soup to those who had survived. Every bowl she handed out felt like penance and redemption tangled together. Once, an old woman thanked her in a trembling voice, saying, "You serve like an American." Marta almost smiled. She wanted to explain that mercy was not American or German, that it was a hunger all people shared when the world went mad. But she said nothing, just offered another bowl. Letters arrived from across the sea. Helen's handwriting looped like music. She wrote about the rains, the garden, the empty bunks. She ended each letter the same way. Be kind, even when it hurts. Marta kept them folded in her apron pocket, reading them until the ink faded. Years later, when she married and built a small clinic near Bremen, people often asked where she learned her tenderness. She never spoke of Texas. She only said, "Once, someone fed me when I did not deserve to eat." And on quiet nights, when wind rustled the wheat outside her window, she would hear the echo of the dinner bell, ringing across an ocean of time. The sound no longer called her to eat, it called her to remember. The fence was gone, the war long buried, but mercy had never stopped ringing.